Welcome to Fading Causes with me, Mukesh Kapila. My guest today has spent more than 30 years battling against two of the most contentious issues on our planet, climate change and migration. He's Ovais Sarmad, who until recently was at the level of an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He describes himself as a congenital, stubborn optimist. Is he seeing something that most of us ordinary mortals don't? Or is he laboring under a grand delusion? Well, let's find out. Ovais, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. A great pleasure to be with you.
You were until recently the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, where you labored for 6 long years. And in that role, what aspect of your personality was most exercised? Your stubbornness or your optimism?
I would say optimism followed by stubbornness. So let me just give you a bit of perspective. I am a survivor of a fatal plane crash and a fatal car accident. That further strengthened my view that one has to be constructively optimist about anything, no matter what it is. And that I have brought into my professional life. And so in the context of climate change, 6 years with Climate Change Secretariat were very intense, complex, messy, combined. So optimism helped me get through that.
Great, Ovais. That's a good start. As you know, we are unfortunately speaking within a few hours of a fatal air crash in India, where we both come from. And your reference to your own survival from accidents rings a bell. And long may that optimism continued. I don't know how that one person in seat 11A, survived and literally walked off the plane, didn't he?
Yeah.
So I'm sure they'll be doing the investigations, but more important in a kind of spiritual way is to ask the question: Why did he survive? Why did you survive? What are we here for?
Yeah.
Now, you've said yourself on climate change that the world has a knowledge, it knows what needs to be done, and we also have the tools and agreements ratified. But what the world needs is implementation.
Right.
Explain to our listeners the general state of play in terms of progress on climate change adaptation and mitigation.
Right. Now, the most important thing to realize is 2015 was a watershed moment, a turning point with the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And in the multilateral system, the United Nations, that was the only agreement that was adopted unanimously, and not only just adopted, but very next year ratified, because it needed 2/3 of member states or parties to put it through their national legislative process to approve it. So that happened, and that was not expected that would happen so quickly. So that shows the power of, or the clarity and the purpose of Paris Agreement. The principal objective of that was to remain within 2 degrees global warming as compared to pre-industrial level, preferably to 1.5 degrees. I'll come to that a bit later, because now even 1.5 degrees is too dangerous now. We have already crossed that. And that was to be by the end of the century, 75 years from now. And we have already crossed those limits. So it is a very, very clear, very powerful agreement. So that's what I strongly believe, that there is no more time for debating whether or not that agreement is implementable or the nuances of it, but to get on with it. Now, from what I have seen, implementation is happening, no doubt about it. Implementation, from adaptation to mitigation to actually more than that, to raising awareness and bringing the message to the masses around the world, and especially the youth. That has happened. If you look back in the last 10, 20 years, I think from that point onwards now, there is a major change and shift. So we're living through that. It's a question of now to accelerate that change.
What sort of adaptation changes are happening around the world?
Well, mostly in many countries which are at the front lines of climate change. They are, first of all, they're aware, they have the tools and technology to foresee the disaster so they can better prepare themselves. And this has to be looked at in the context of the enormity of the challenge and what tools and resources, and especially dollars, actually, or money, is available to those who need to adapt. So adaptation is happening. There are several mechanisms. You have the Global Adaptation Fund, the Green Environment Facility, the Loss and Damage Fund, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, all of those. And there are multi-million dollars in those funds that are predominantly or only provided to help countries in the global south. But again, I have to contextualize that by saying that, yes, all of that is still way less to what is actually needed. A good example of that was last year in Baku, the Baku COP. The global adaptation needs were estimated to be 1.3 trillion. The parties agreed to provide 300 billion. So we're looking at gaps. But then the adaptation train has already left the platform. So it's a question of different actors, the different stakeholders need to accelerate.
As you say, the train has left the platform, but what about those who haven't caught the train? What's happening on mitigation? And we see the consequences of climate change every day around the world.
Exactly. That's true. The ones who have not boarded that train, they will soon realize that they will have to either run fast and catch up with it or face extinction. And to that, it was a famous saying from the Saudi oil minister in one of the OPEC meetings, who said that Stone Age didn't end because of lack of stones. And therefore, fossil fuel age will not end because of lack of fossil fuels. Humanity would have found different sources of energy, different ways of living. So we are living through that transition. Because when you live through those big, major shifts in history and geopolitics and societal changes, it's difficult to pinpoint that change and how it impacts us, but we're living through it.
But don't you think that the change of a problem that is existentialist for the planet and for people, it's happening too slowly? And with all the disasters that are everywhere, and you are in Spain as I speak to you, and Spain has had terrible floods as well as extreme heat, and livelihoods have been affected and lives as well. What consolation is this to those people?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. While we are debating what needs to be done, actions need to be accelerated. There are countries around the world. You have the Gulf states and now, unfortunately, the United States, who sometimes backtrack and don't do what is really needed from a scientific point of view or for the good of humanity. So we see the consequences of it. And the important thing is climate change does not respect any borders. It does not stop from one ecosystem to the other. It just devastates. So even those countries who are skeptical, not doing enough, they are being impacted. You said Spain, where I live, about half an hour from Valencia. And I saw firsthand the disaster there. It is just mind-boggling. And you cannot explain to people who have been affected by calamities, you need to do more to adapt or to mitigate and all those things because it's about their lives and livelihoods. So coming back to my original thinking that one needs to remain optimistic. We need to look at all the positives that are happening even amidst those disasters and hang on to those and try to leverage those.
So I suppose we can agree that the glass is at least half full. And and I can see why you are a stubborn optimist. You have endured, I think that's the right word, endured, 5 climate change COPs. These are the Conference of Parties of member states jamborees where nations argue to agree the least they can get away with, but perhaps I'm being too cynical there. Can you explain what the COP process has been like?
Right, yeah. Now the COPs are, as you said, jamborees, and sometimes I call it Frankenstein circuses. It becomes too big, too complex, too diversified in many ways, and there's so many actors. And Dubai was the largest number of participants, 110,000 or so. And to organize and host any of those COP, you're talking about $200 million at the least. So, going back to my previous point about Paris Agreement adopted in 2015, there is no more need for a large treaty kind of agreement. It's already there. So these COPs have, as a result, broken up and gone in all kinds of directions because they don't have one single purpose. Therefore, they've become, as I said, Frankenstein circus. Nobody can control it anymore. And I can speak more freely now that I'm outside the climate change or UN system. So what happens in those COPs there is a small space called the blue zone where the parties come together and negotiate until they're blue in face on minor issues, mostly, and on how to interpret what's contained in the Paris Agreement. And they can spend days and hours in doing that instead of really coming there to showcase what has been done, what needs to be done, and how to get it done. So that is the smaller space. But the bigger space is where all the non-party stakeholders get together. And that is actually a very powerful platform. So that's where you have corporations, civil society, individuals, innovation that is showcased. But that is not what the media reports on. Media only reports on what happens in that small balloon of member states. But outside it, that's called the green zone, is where all the climate action takes place and breakthroughs happen. Innovative solutions are displayed, partnerships and deals made. So that is very good. But again, that doesn't need to happen in one big event at the COPs. It needs to be democratized, and it need not be in one location. It should be spread out in different parts of the world because it's become so big. No small country or even medium-sized country can ever host things like that. So that is what happens in the COPs. And since Paris Agreement, they had to agree on the guidelines or the implementation rule book, as they call it, which has been done. So now it's really digging into the full stops and the commas and what a certain word means. And it is far distant from really the actual implementation that countries need to focus on.
I have this question for you. It's human nature that when you experience a trauma yourself, you kind of learn from it and change your behavior. Say, for example, if you had a heart attack because your diet wasn't good and you survived, you would probably think, oh my God, I'm spared. I better do something. Do you think that as countries experience the direct effects of climate change in Spain or wherever there are people suffering from floods, disasters, forest fires, and so many other environmental disasters, do you think implementation will accelerate as countries and people themselves experience the worst of climate change impacts?
Yeah, I would hope that would happen. But as we know, when we talk about countries, we talk about the political cycles of governments' tenure and mandate. Usually in the Western world, it ranges from 4 to 5 years, and they have to do whatever they need during that period. So, and then they have all kinds of other issues and challenges. So, but what I have seen is that climate change has now become a cross-cutting issue. So every government, no matter where, small, big, medium, they all are aware of it, and they have, in some fashion or the other, some more, some not so much, integrated climate change solutions and actions into their policies. The best example recently is China. China has submitted their national determined contribution, the National Climate Plan for 2025, that includes all sectors of their economy. And they have very clearly set out the goals and fully aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. Mm-hmm. And there are many countries also doing that. And the European Union is another very good example.
I think your China example is interesting because China is a huge emitter, and what China does has a bearing on the planet.
It does.
Do you think, therefore, that actually what's important is not what every country, little one in particular, do, but what the big ones do? Because that affects the planet as a whole. The little ones are suffering, and for them, mitigation is important. But for those who are primarily responsible for carbon emissions, they bear a global responsibility to reduce that.
The smaller countries, for them, adaptation is more important than mitigation because they don't emit, so they don't need to mitigate. But it's the Chinas and the United States and the economies who are India, for that matter, are growing and accelerating in their own development, they are the ones who are emitting, and they need to mitigate. They need to cut down, they need to slow down or even stop the emissions, because there is no more emission budget left in the atmosphere to take any more. There are promising sort of measures being put in place, but more needs to happen. So we come back to the COPs, the question that you asked. The COPs need to completely change their method of work and really focus on that countries are implementing what they said in their plans. Submitting a plan is one thing. I'm going back to China, they submitted it, but there has to be accountability, a measurement process of checking back. Yes, you said that you'll do all that. Have you done it? That is missing in the COP process.
Should there be sanctions? Accountability is valueless without penalty if you don't keep your promises. But, in the international system, we're not good at doing that for any issue. So any special mechanisms or new ideas for that?
No, unfortunately, in the multilateral system, sanctions never work. And even if they are sort of implemented, they don't have the impact they supposed to. It's mostly then becomes a question of show and tell and who's doing what. And this is where the UN is able to and should actually clearly, transparently report on where the countries are in implementation, so that can be clearly displayed. And the best measure of that is then the public perception.
So accountability is to your own citizens in your own country, even if we have a multilateral framework for doing so.
Absolutely.
I've been to one or two COPs myself, and that was totally enough.
Which ones did you go to?
I went to Poznan in particular.
Oh, yes.
And that was highly tedious. So I admire your staying power. Any lessons and tips for others negotiating on tricky issues?
Yeah, the negotiations in the UN multilateral system, they are heavy, complex. But then what is very important is the negotiations not only about climate change. There are strings attached to it. There are trade, there's security, there are all kinds of other things brought as leverages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And here's another positive aspect of the way one can think about it. Climate change is a unifier that can bring about a solution to different aspects of any societal change. I've seen that in those negotiations. And so there is give and take. Although negotiations are about climate change, there are other things that feed in and get resolved.
In the discussions I've witnessed, the toxic issue has been funding.
Correct.
And particularly debates around climate justice. The notion being that those who have polluted most the world since we industrialized should bear the bulk of the responsibility for funding mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah.
It's a parallel argument to the one on slavery, incidentally. But where do you stand on this historic justice angle to financing climate action?
Yeah. Now, as in other multilateral systems, the world gets divided between the global north and global south. If you dig into it, no one can really define what is global north and what is global south. But interestingly, in climate change process, countries are divided between Annex 1 and Annex 2, the developed and the developing world. Interestingly, China is in the developing world. So therefore, they don't have to mitigate. They can also benefit from the funding, which is a no-brainer. And this is what Paris Agreement tried, and I think has been successful in delineating that difference. So Paris Agreement requires all countries, no matter who they are, whether in Annex 1 or Annex 2 or Global North, Global South, they all need to do all of it. Mitigation, adaptation, and provision of finance. Provision of funding is a major stumbling block in the climate negotiations, because that fight relates to justice, and the justice is kind of captured into this famous CBRD principle, common but differentiated responsibilities. That goes back to the convention, 1992. So that clearly identified that those who created this problem are the ones who should be most responsible and accountable to make good and provide that funding, technology transfer, capacity building, and so on to the developing world. That in the 30 years of climate negotiations has not happened as it should. And in the 6 years that I was there, I've also seen that division happen. My take on that is then there is no point fighting about it. Yes, you recognize that is what has happened, but now it's an existential issue. You cannot hang on to, look, you are the bad guys and you need to bend down and regret and compensate for it. That's not going to happen. But instead, there are many other ways. As I mentioned, there are those 4 or 5 funds that are extremely important. So those countries should then go out and see how they can maximize funding to those who are in need. And then you break away that developing country barrier and have countries like China and Gulf states and others who can spend money on all kinds of things, arms and other things, and instead then provide that funding to adaptation.
I'm sure this debate will carry on even as the world burns. So let's turn to another topic on which you expended actually most of your professional life, 27 years before you got into climate change. That issue is migration. You were the chief of staff at IOM, the International Organization for Migration, a UN agency headquartered in Geneva with presences all over the world. And let me ask first, on the broad topic of migration, what's your overall personal view on what drives the movement of people? And is migration good or bad?
In very short, migration is good, is beneficial, it's even desirable if it is managed properly. And the most important thing to realize is majority of 9 billion of us, 97% are staying put. It's only about 3 or 4% of the 9 billion who are in some form of migratory status. And of those, majority are in regular migrations, working, contributing to their host countries and sending back money to their countries of origin and so on. But what gets attention in the media is that boat that crosses the Mediterranean, or the movement between southern United States and North Mexico border. That is the irregular migration. But in reflecting back to the main question is migration good or bad? It's absolutely good. It benefits societies, it enriches humanity, culture, this is economy.
Then why has it become such a toxic issue, politicized all over the world?
Because it is politicized. Now I'm outside the United Nations and I can speak more freely. It's the inability of those countries at the receiving end of irregular migration not being able to manage that, either in the sea or the land border and other places. They need to manage it. There are tools, mechanisms available to the host country, the transit country, and country of origin. Although migration is the only global issue which does not have a treaty such as refugees or climate change, but migration has a global compact adopted in 2016, 2017, and it has a very comprehensive mechanism and workflows on how to manage all aspects of migration, the regular, irregular, forced, and internally displaced.
The irregular migration happens with and is facilitated by intermediaries who make a lot of money from it.
Right.
And they're called modern slavers or human traffickers and so on. And there's all sorts of nasty things that go on in terms of exploiting people who are desperately wanting to move. Do you think that the liberal human rights world order, which is the foundation of trying to build a tolerable world, that liberal approaches to migration management are therefore dead? They've had their day? Because human traffickers don't respect that. And governments may or may not have the capacity to deal with the consequences. And meanwhile, the irregular migrants are the ones who are suffering every day.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the human trafficking, and I've seen this firsthand while at IOM. I think that's the worst form of slavery that anyone can experience. And the human traffickers, in fact, by some estimates, there is more money in human trafficking than in drug trafficking. And that's just so horrible, toxic, and very, very dangerous. And this is trading human lives. We thought slavery ended decades ago, but it's not, unfortunately. So that is still a major issue that needs to be handled. But again, I point out to countries who have the capacity, who have the wherewithal, who have the resources, technology, and intelligence, that they are not doing enough to stop it. They're not doing enough to penalize it where and when it happens. And therefore, in the end, yes, the poor people, poor migrants who set out on the journeys to find better lives in different parts of the world, they suffer. Again, if all of that is managed properly, those migrants are needed in many different economies. If they have legal pathways, that all can be done in a way which is beneficial to everyone. So I think Western governments have not done enough to really crack down on human trafficking.
This raises another interesting issue, which has become more complicated as the years have gone by. After the Second World War, we had the Refugee Convention, 1951, as a consequence of the European war. And this got extended worldwide. And this was a huge advance, recognizing that people had the right to flee and seek asylum from wars and from human rights abuses and atrocities. Refugees, as recognized by the convention, are under threat as well. Countries are closing borders. But in addition, we have millions of others fleeing environmental disaster. We just talked about climate change. So millions are fleeing climate change. And it's only the lucky ones who actually manage to cross the borders. Most of the others remain inside borders where there are no conventions or rights. There are codes of conduct, there are norms, but quite honestly, they're even in the worst of opposition. So, do you think should people fleeing environmental disasters and economic poverty be treated in the same way as those fleeing wars and atrocities? Who deserves more international protection? Isn't international law covering people movement seen a little bit of a mess nowadays?
Absolutely, it is. I think because the Refugee Convention, as you rightly said, it was adopted soon after the Second World War to take care of that displacement, and we're talking about 80 years since then. So, world and situations have changed. No one would have thought about climate refugees at that time, or climate migration or displacement. Human trafficking and the various forms of human mobility that takes place, and the convention doesn't cover much of that now. So there is definitely argument can be made to question whether that convention is still relevant to today's day. But as we know, those global treaties and conventions, they are there, they have been adopted, and they remain intact forever, unfortunately.
Well, I think it was amazing that the world, in the shock of the Second World War, actually agreed the Refugee Convention. Now, I wonder whether we would even agree that. And I doubt whether we should do anything to the Refugee Convention because we might actually harm it. The question is whether those fleeing wars and persecutions have higher human rights than those fleeing poverty and environmental decline. I mean, de facto, that's the case. So we have an unsatisfactory situation where we have two types of rights. And I think none of us can defend that. The question is whether or not we can find a mechanism to, as you were saying earlier, manage it in a more realistic manner. And this, would you agree with the failing sustainable development goals, which means that poverty, which is often a driver for people moving, is probably going to stay with us for longer than we wanted. And that will be another force to drive irregular movements of people, as we are seeing in Africa across the Sahara.
Yeah, I think human mobility, I use the term human mobility because that encompasses migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, and the push factors are so many: disasters, environment, economy, seeking better life, conflicts, and fleeing from gangs of violence. So there are so many forms of it. But you linked it to the central human rights principle. What I believe is everyone should be treated equally regardless of their status. Then human rights applies to everyone, no matter who they are, where they come from, whatever their status are. So that should be fundamental. And then comes whether they are to be classified as refugees, economic migrants, climate displaced individuals, or internally displaced, and those who have not crossed the border. And there are very clear definitions of each of those categories, and there are measures and different organizations who provide assistance, provide solutions to those different categories of people on the move. And that leads me to those organizations responsible, predominantly UNHCR and IOM. They do the job, but
You ask a very good question. There are a lot of unresolved issues in the on the human mobility scene, and that debate will continue. Do you think the search for answers is being helped or hindered by the fact that we have two organizations, IOM, where you worked, and UNHCR, which is just around the corner in Geneva? So the whole debate around human mobility is fractured, and the institutional divides and competition doesn't help. Do you think the two organizations should be merged, not least now with funding cut, thanks to not just Trump, but also other donors? Do you think it's time to reform the structure for handling human mobility?
absolutely. I think, yes, the reform is the right word, whether it ends up in merger or clarifying the mandates and clearly defining the roles and responsibilities of the two different organizations. Both were set up soon after the Second World War with different mandates, but the world has changed and the whole gamut of human mobility has become complex, and it has so many different aspects in terms of what is driving it. In the 27 years I was with IOM, never a period has gone by where those two organizations were not at loggerheads when there was an critical issue in Mozambique, or the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, or fighting over the definition of who is who. If an individual who needs assistance, is that individual a refugee or a migrant or an internally displaced person? And that should not happen. The institutional prerogative of these organizations, somehow they, in the end, work things out, but it's not the most efficient.
One of the things I find remarkable, not just in talking to you, but also to other friends we've had on this program, that when people have retired from institutions, they are much more frank and open than when they were in those institutions. And by the way, that applies to me as well. I don't think I could have be involved in this program or to write the articles I do if I was still in the international system. Isn't that a pity? Why can't international civil servants, good people trying to make the world a better place in many different bodies, why can't they be licensed to have honest debates in the way that we are having now?
I wish that would be the case, but again, that goes back to the reform of the entire multilateral system, not just from an organizational point of view, but really the ethos of those organizations, the way they conduct themselves and address global issues, which is what they were created to address. But they've become so bureaucratic and so cumbersome. The rules and regulations of these multilateral organizations date back to, again, just after the Second World War, and not much has changed. And unfortunately, in order to change it, you need to have a unanimous decision and blessed by the Permanent Five, which unfortunately is a broken system, as we know.
Well, that leads me, as we come to the end of our chat, to ask you postscript about the role of the next generation. I saw YouTube of you where all these young people were eating out of your hand. You were saying very nice things about young people and so on. And it was very touching. So, tongue in cheek, let me ask you whether this is just a ritual thing we old people kind of say, okay, we haven't solved the problem during our time in power and influence, and now let's pass on the burden to these young people in the hope that they will solve them. But do you think that young people really have some special magic that will enable them to find the solutions that we fail to deliver?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And in fact, I do not know where. I think it's either on LinkedIn or on Twitter. The banner of my entry has an Indian proverb which says that we did not inherit the environment and everything that we enjoy today from our previous generation, but we have borrowed it from future generation. So if you have that understanding that if you borrow something that you have an obligation to protect it and hand over in a responsible manner to the future, to whoever we have borrowed it from, this is the future generation. So that actually what drives me. And in the climate change in the last 6 years, I got to engage with the youth who participate in big numbers and very emphatically to really raise the voice that it's about their future. It's about the environment that they will inherit, and that the elder the generation represented by us and mostly the decision makers in multilateral systems are not doing what they need to do. So they raised their voice. And Greta Thunberg was the one who came to COP24 in Katowice, and that shook me. Actually, I was there to receive her. By then, at that time, not many people knew about Greta Thunberg. That sort of started the whole youth movement for climate change, and I think there is a lot of meaning, a lot of enthusiasm, the purpose of that younger generation, and that's I have great belief in that movement, because that they are the ones who will change it, who will, well, first of all have to deal with it, but they also have the power to change it, and they're changing it one at a time.
I was skeptical when we started our conversation, but I think you have succeeded in making me more optimistic and forward-oriented. And for that, I thank you. And thank you for being my guest on Fading Causes today.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. And I really enjoyed this discussion, and I wish you all the best to the Fading Causes initiative that you've taken.